I wanted to talk to you today about analytics at Facebook. And historically, when you think about analytics within organizations, it's really been treated as a service function where the goal has been to focus on handling the requests that are coming from other areas of business. But I think the role of the analyst in the last few years, 5 years or so, has really started to change quite a bit and has become much more focused on being a proactive role that really drives impact in the business. And I think big data has helped that quite a bit. Big data gives us a lot more access to a lot more data, so we can get a lot more insights, and that helps us drive even more impact. At Facebook, what we're trying to do is really embrace this idea of the analyst as a proactive driver of the business versus the historical reactive role. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. When you think about analytics, I want to make sure that we're all thinking about it holistically. When I talk to a lot of people at other companies about analytics, generally the first question I get is, so what do you guys use? What are your technologies? And I think technology is definitely an important component. We'll talk a little bit about it. But it's really just one piece of it. The next most common question I get is, what do you guys analyze? And that's also obviously a really, really important part. But it's less about what we analyze. That's not the question I really like to talk about as much. The more important part is, what are you doing with the results of those analyses? That's really what you need to focus on. And to be able to ensure that the results of your analyses are actually having some impact somewhere in the company, you really need to focus on these last two parts, which are what's the culture of your company and what's the org structure you've got in place. Those, almost more than anything else, help determine whether analytics is just going to be something that comes up with interesting insights or whether analytics is really going to be a driver of your business. So I'm going to go through all four of these. That's basically the outline of what we're going to talk about. Starting with technology, as I mentioned, technology is only a piece of the overall picture, but it does act as a foundation, so it's a pretty good place to start. Anytime anybody's talking about technology and analytics, it pretty quickly turns towards this discussion about big data. And I think by any definition you can come up with, Facebook has big data. But that doesn't really mean that much because it's not exactly clear what the term even means. For most people, when they talk about big data, they think it refers to the exclusion of other things, it's a set of new technologies. But it's not really about the new technologies. The technologies enable some things, but for me, the way I really think about it is it's really helping us address some business needs that have been challenging us for a long, long time, and we can finally address some of them. But as you'll see on some subsequent points that I want to make, it doesn't mean that this is the panacea and that we throw out everything we've done before. But hold that thought. For this, it's really about some key business needs, and when I look back at the types of business needs that it really helps us with, it kind of falls into three buckets. And the first bucket is really about taking what we're doing today, but doing more of it, doing it in a way that gives us deeper insights than we were ever able to get before. So that really kind of falls into the area of two different buckets. And the first thing is about, can we get all of our data on one system? And for those of you who've been in this industry for a long time, and I'm sure most of you have, we always have had to have data warehouses and data marts and multiple of them. And that's fine, but the problem is it makes things a lot harder to get correlations between things. If we want to look at user actions and how that correlates to the size and shape of your user graph, both of those are very big data sets. Traditionally, you'd store both of those in separate systems. But if we can put them together, it makes it much easier to explore the data together and find correlations about how one behavior affects the other. The second thing is we get to do a lot more details versus aggregates. And I know a lot of people on my team, even just in recent weeks, always struggle with, no, we need to aggregate this data. We've got too much data. But at least now the discussion about too much data is about the cost of the data, not the system can't handle that amount of data. When you've got the details, we can start looking at cohorts at a very, very fine-grained level for users. We can, instead of looking at the average user in Brazil, we can look at males in Brazil who've been on our service for 2 years who use Android phones. And if you're trying to optimize some product or some service, doing it for the average user doesn't really work all that well. One of the key things for growth, and if you saw last month's presentation, one of the key things for growth is being able to get down to very small groups of individuals and target for them and figure out how do you make products that can address the needs of individuals, not just the average person, because nobody is the average person. So the ability to do that, that's one of the biggest things, is one of the biggest advantages I've seen out of being able to put everything in one system, and big data technologies has really helped us do that. The second area is wholly new areas of analysis that we haven't really done much of historically, because SQL wasn't very good at this. So when we've got things like MapReduce, it makes it a bit easier to look at the social graph or any graph, for example, and figure out not just how closely am I connected to my friends, but how closely connected are they to each other, and does that matter? It also enables us to do things, again, which would be very tough to do in straight SQL, things like, okay, we've got a news feed, and there's thousands and thousands of stories that we could show in your news feed. Which one's going to be best, and how do we know that, and how do we test that? It's much easier to do that in some of these newer technologies. The third area is something that you're always going to want, which is how do we do things faster? And I kind of grew up in the more traditional data warehousing world initially, where you have ETL, which then puts things into a warehouse, which then gets read and interacted with through BI tools. The problem with that always has been it's a fairly brittle ecosystem because it all has to share the same schema. So if we change something somewhere, you've got to change it everywhere. Otherwise, you've just broken the whole chain. Well, now we get to move a lot faster now because we've got these tools that allow us to work without schemas until we want them. So we're not required to have one. So this is all stuff that I think you guys all know, but what I wanted to really point out is these are the business needs that I really think of. I don't really think about it in terms of technology. And then because we can think about it in terms of business need, it enables us to think of not just new technologies, we want to use existing technologies as well. So though we started historically as pretty much a pure Hadoop shop, we always had a little bit of relational, we are moving more and more towards using relational where we think it will be best used. So again, I don't think that just because Hadoop allows you to scale more means that you should no longer be using relational. And you go to conference after conference about big data, and every panel is about NoSQL, and it's the end of SQL, and I think that is just absolutely idiotic. There are things that Hadoop is fantastic at that I would never want to do in SQL. And those are some of the things I talked about on the prior slide. Just in general, if I've got a huge amount of data and I don't exactly know what I'm looking for, I can't think of a better thing to use than Hadoop to figure out what value there is in those systems. But if I know what I want to look at, if I know that there are some core metrics that are really driving my business, it is much easier to use things like SQL. SQL was defined to allow me to look at metrics sliced by dimensions. And if that's what I want to do, why don't I do that? So just some specific examples. Like if I want to figure out users who have not filled in their country of origin or where they currently are, we want to figure out what country they're in so we can figure out how many users we have in each country. Well, there's lots and lots of signals that we can pick up on. For example, where are all your friends? And you're probably in a similar country to your friends. It gets a lot more advanced than that. But trying to algorithmically assign users to various countries is a great thing that we can do through a lot of the analysis we're doing with Hadoop. It would be fairly hard to do that with the traditional SQL. But if I want to look at what's going on with the trends in photos over a 2-year period, it's going to be far faster and far easier to do it in relational. It's optimized for these things. It may be 10 times faster to do it in relational. So I think this is a little counterculture to what we see in Silicon Valley, where a lot of people are saying you really need to go to this NoSQL movement. And a friend of mine who works at Cloudera once said something, and so I'll give him credit for coming up with it, or at least he was the first person I heard say it. The idea of NoSQL, the NO should stand for not only. So that's what I'm trying to get us to do here, and we're all working on that in terms of being a lot more broad. And the quote I've got at the top, the genius of and versus the tyranny of or, is really the foundation of this. And it comes from an old professor of mine at Stanford, a guy named Jim Collins, who wrote a book, Built to Last. And he talks about You can do more if you think about A and B versus A or B. So we really try to embrace the right tool for the right job, and I think it's going to give us a lot more flexibility. It's something we're in the process of moving towards right now. So a little bit of an experiment, but I have pretty high hopes for it. So a little more about where we would use each one. So if I look at it like split up in these three areas, the type of analysis, if it's, again, where I'm trying to figure out what's the value in the data, that's when I would recommend that we look at something like Hadoop. If I know the value and I want to drive dashboards off it, if I want to do some querying on it to slice a particular metric that I know is valuable to us, like daily active users or monthly active users or photo uploads or whatever it may be, I would prefer to do that in a traditional relational system. It's simpler and generally much, much faster. Data granularity. Well, you've got all the grain you could ever want and more in a system like Hadoop. You're not really going to have that. Traditional relational systems can't handle that yet. A few petabytes is about the real max. We're going to push systems a little beyond that, but we will be on the bleeding edge. But they've got the transformed data. They've got the pre-aggregated data. So when I know what I want to aggregate on, it's okay to aggregate in that case. Then it's just much easier to use. So as analysts, it makes you a lot more efficient. And the last one, time frame. Well, the data in our systems initially flows into Hadoop. So if I want to see what's going on right now, you're going to have to go to Hadoop to get that. And that's where we'll do most of our monitoring. But if I want to find trends over the last 2 or 3 years, then definitely you want to go to something like relational. Again, it's simpler and easier. So I want to make sure we've got the maximum amount of data that we can analyze and then the maximum amount of simplicity when it's not a wide open field, when we really know what we want to look at. So that's the foundational part. That enables us to do all the great analyses that we ultimately want to do. And just to frame the whole topic of analysis itself, historically, everything started with just basic reporting. The first jobs I had were about creating just reports. Highly, highly reactive job. Felt like I was part of Comcast or working at a fast food joint, which was, here's your report. Do you want fries with that? And the notion was we were just fulfilling the needs of others because we had a special talent that others didn't have. Then somebody got the bright idea of, okay, yes, you need to really focus on insights. And probably the most common thing up until about a year or two ago was actionable insights. You've got to come up with something that we can act on. Otherwise, reports aren't all that interesting. Actionable insights is really where it's at. I think that's good, but it definitely does not go far enough. And the underlying theme of everything I talk about, either here or just anywhere in our organization, is if people don't act on it, if it is actionable but nobody acts on it, you have added no value. You'll hear me say that a few times tonight, but that is the fundamental premise, that if they don't act on it, just because they can act on it, if they haven't, you haven't done your job as an analyst. So I'm talking about impact. And one thing I need to do is define that term. So what do I mean when I talk about impact? It's generally one of 3 things, and they don't tend to exist in isolation. You rarely have any one of these by itself, but it means one of 3 things. First, it's about moving a metric. You have impact if the work you've done leads to some metric that you care about moving in the direction you want it to. Second thing when you're talking about impact is changing a product. So what is it that we can do where we can make recommendations to make the product better, smaller, faster, just more in line with the needs of what people want it to do? And then the third one is changing a process. There was something that was inefficient. We did a lot of analysis on it. We figured out ways to do it a lot more efficiently. Now what I'm talking about in terms of these not existing in isolation, it's generally going to be the case that if you change a product in a way that is good, then a metric that you care about is going to move in the right direction, and so on. So they tend to influence each other. But anytime we do anything, at the end of the quarter, we look at what was our impact. And it's not about here are the analyses we ran and here's the dashboards we built. It's what actually happened to the product. What happened to the metric? Did we change something internally and we do something better than we used to? So that's what we need to hang our hats on. Those are the things that make me really excited about being an analyst. So how do we get impact to happen? And there is a process. I wouldn't say this is a rigid process. I'm not a big fan of rigid processes, but a framework that I can think about is something that I do like. It allows us to think about where we are along the way and what we need to be doing next. Now, this is a very simple rendition of a lot of how we make impact happen through analytics. There's a first part of it, which is the table stakes part, which don't even think about the right side of the screen until you have this left part nailed. The table stakes start with you have got to come up with a goal, a measurable goal for what you're trying to do. If you don't have a way to measure what you're trying to do, or you don't have a specific goal other than we're going to release the product, you're wasting your time. You should go look for other projects to do your analysis on. Come up with a goal, figure out what's the right metric. How are we going to measure the success of our ability to reach that goal? And then the last part is log it. And that's often a hard part because we often don't have the ability, some cases we do, but we often don't have the ability to do the logging ourselves. We've got to get the engineers to log all of the metrics that we need. And they're busy trying to get the functions to work and get the functionality to work and get the product itself to work. And doing logging almost feels like commenting your code. It's something that I know I'm supposed to do it, but nobody's going to slap my wrist if I don't do it. I am going to get my wrist slapped if the product doesn't work. But if I'm not logging this stuff, nobody's going to care. Well, we care a lot, and it's part of the culture, I'll get to that a little bit later, that you have to have logging as a fundamental job for the engineer. As fundamental as testing your code, or somebody testing it. You don't want to release products, and I know we all have, but you don't want to release products without testing them. For the same reason you shouldn't ever release products without logging it, because then you don't know if you actually are going to be able to achieve the goal, or if you have achieved the goal that you set out. You can guess, but you won't actually know. So once you get that, though, then you've got the data you need to actually start doing stuff with it. And this is where the fun part kicks in. And you get this little cycle here of understand, identify, and execute. And I'll go through each one of those, what each one of those means. So the understand phase is the first step, and it's much more about getting the right answers. Sorry, it's not about getting the right answers. It's much more about figuring out what the right questions are. So I've often been asked, what do you think makes a really good analyst? And a lot of times, I think people are expecting answers about what particular skill sets they've got, technical skill sets they've got. I think those are absolutely required. Without those, you can't get answers. But there are also a lot of tools now. There's a plethora of tools that we can use to help us get answers a lot faster than we ever could 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So it becomes less and less about your ability to get the answer. And it becomes a lot more about figuring out what's the right question you should be asking. When you've got as much data as these, quote, big data systems can hold, there's an infinite number of questions you can ask. So if you're not asking the right ones, you will spend all of your time focusing on meaningless things, and you will come up with brilliant answers to questions that nobody cares about, which is a complete waste of our time. So, like, for example, when we're looking at our messaging product, we want to think about when we're doing this understand phase, it's trying to get a lay of the land of where we are. We want to look at the who, what, where, why, and when. Who's using it? Who is messaging? What types of people? What products are they using? When are they sending messages? And how long is it taking people to reply to those messages? How are they navigating to that feature of the application to send a message? These are the things we want to know. And ultimately, if you can get to, and why are they even sending a message in the first place, which can be hard just from standard data. Sometimes you've got to get survey data in there as well. But these are the things that you really want to get to understand what's going on. The purpose of this phase is to get us to the next phase, which is the identify phase. Once you have an understanding of what's going on in the products or in that area of your business, then you can start figuring out where are there opportunities for me to improve something. And I think this is the most challenging part. It's the trickiest part of the whole analytics cycle because it requires a careful combination of art and science. The science is where you can use your analysis to figure out where there are anomalies, where you are over-indexed or under-indexed in the data that you just got out of the out of the understand phase. The creativity part is, now that I have found areas that look odd, what am I going to do about it? And usually analysis isn't going to give you that answer. That's when you've got to have creativity, where you've got to have business domain knowledge. That's where you're going to come up with answers that are the ahas and the insights that aren't coming directly from the data. And an example of this would be, we were looking not that long ago at the process of creating an ad for the people who are for the first time creating an ad. These are new advertisers. And we're looking at the process of, there's a flow that they go through and has multiple steps, and how long people are spending in each of these steps, and how many people are making it to the next step. One of the things through that understand phase that we uncovered was there's a large number of people, much more than expected, who are spending more than 15 minutes in this funnel of creating ads, but who don't actually ever successfully create an ad. So that was not expected. We expected people to kind of kick tires for a minute and then they'd bail out, but anybody who's spending 15 minutes or more and leaves without doing what they set out to do, something sounds weird there. So we dig a little deeper and we find out that in many of those cases, more than 10 of the 15 minutes is them in the help system. Again, an anomalous result that wasn't expected. So that's the science part. The art part is, what do you do about that? Does that mean the help system sucks and you have to fix that? Does it mean the whole flow itself is off and we need to reinvent that? If so, what's wrong with the flow and how do we reinvent it? What should we try? Generally, you won't get all of those answers from the science. You need to have the creativity in there as well. So I've been talking about having this balance between the two, and it can be really, really hard. To get the balance right, you have to avoid, what I refer to as you have to avoid hippos and groundhogs. So let me talk about hippos first. You are in a hippo situation when you don't have enough science, when you've got kind of too much of the creativity. You know you're in a hippo situation when you've got somebody who's sitting at the table, pounding their fists on the table saying, I've been here for 5 years, I've got more experience than you guys have, I've been through this more often than you guys have, I know what I'm doing, this is the way we should be doing this. If you don't have any data to refute them, the hippo will win. They will get their way. That's where data can become powerful. And what does HIPPO stand for? The highest paid person's opinion. So that's the HIPPO. You need to avoid that situation. You also need to avoid groundhogs. Does anybody recognize where that's from? It's from the movie Groundhog Day. Groundhog is this situation where you've got too much science. And in the movie Groundhog Day, you've got Phil, who for some unknown reason is stuck reliving the same exact day over and over and over again. And in the movie, he really likes Rita, and he decides to go out on a date with Rita. And unfortunately, it is a really bad date. It does not go well at all. But Phil realizes, okay, you know what? I get to redo this same day over and over again, which means I can do the date over and over again. So I'm going to use each of these as an experiment to figure out what she likes. And he finds out that she likes ice skating, and he finds out that she likes piano playing, and he finds out that she likes French poetry. So he incorporates all of those into these dates, and they subtly get better and better and better. But she never falls for him. All he's really achieved, ultimately, is he's come up with the best possible version of a really bad date. Not until he kind of gives up and says, all right, this isn't working, I'm going to just be myself, I can't think of anything else to do. Not until he gets to that point does she actually fall for him, the spell is broken, he can go on with his life. So to me, this is a Hollywood movie about A/B testing. He is experimenting with different things and seeing, did it work better? Because he gets to live the exact same day over and over, so he can really compare them and figure out which one's working. But he gets stuck at a local maximum, the best possible version of what's still a bad date. So you have to be very careful. The breakthroughs don't necessarily come from data. And that's why some of the best analysts have to have a great combination of both tech savvy, but also some business domain and the ability to come up with new ideas. And an explicit example that I can use from where I worked previously, which was Zynga, where we got stuck in this rut of A/B testing. We had a game that was called Treasure Island. And basically what you had to do is you had these series of islands, and each of these islands had these squares on them. The bigger the island, the more squares it had. And you had to click on every square and find treasure underneath. And it was not until you cleared the entire island that you could go on to the next one. And the game wasn't doing particularly well. We found through analysis that people were getting stuck on the big islands. So we come up with the conclusion that big islands are bad, let's make the islands smaller. And people get to more and more islands now because the islands are smaller. But they still get stuck. Where are they getting stuck? On whatever island is then the biggest island, is the most common place that they're getting stuck. So we make it smaller again. We iterate on this, and eventually we end up with these postage-size stamp islands because we just keep saying big islands seem to be bad. all we were doing is getting stuck in, well, A/B testing says big is bad, let's make it smaller. What we didn't realize is that the fundamental premise of the game took no skill. You just had to mind-numbingly click on every square before you could go to the next island. Until you add in some kind of mystery or some skill of you want to do it in a minimal number of clicks, and there's hints along the way to help you do that, until you get that, you're never going to build a game that was good. So all the A/B testing in the world showing us how to improve the game did nothing to actually improve people's retention in the game. It did not improve the game. We just ended up with tiny little islands that you could fit one tree on. So again, A/B testing has its limits. This is when you have too much science. Don't fall into that trap. It's very, very easy because it's when someone says, I've been through this before, and you say, well, here's the chart, argue that. Who's going to win that argument? So we can win a lot more than the other guys can, but it's not always the right thing. So you've got to be careful with the balance there. So the last part is the execute phase. Once you've identified what the right thing to do is, and it's a combination of the art and the science, then you've got to execute on it. You've got to make it happen. You've got to close the loop, complete the last mile on this. So you have an idea of what you think needs to be done. It's your job to evangelize that. You've then got to work with the rest of the product team to make sure that they actually do what you're stating should be done. And then after that, experiment. I had an idea, it's working okay, let me see if I can use A/B testing then, possibly, or any other mechanism to refine it. And then evaluate the results. So it's the 3 E's, evangelize, experiment, and evaluate. Keep doing that. That's what you really need to focus on. How do we make sure that these types of things are things that are adopted within the company? And I mentioned earlier that org structure is really key to having a proactive analytics organization. There tend to be 2 main org structures that you'll see for analytics. The first one is the centralized organization. And many companies will start in kind of this scenario, where you've got these business teams who are doing whatever they do, creating products, running at different areas of the business. And then you've got these service providers up here, which are the analysts, who are fulfilling the requests of the business teams. The problem with this structure is you are very reactive. You are essentially waiting for requests to come in, and then you are satisfying those needs and getting back to those business teams. It also has this essence of what I call, it's like having a quality division within your company, which would be a situation where you'd say, you know what, we don't need to really focus on quality in our organization because there's a separate organization that does that. So we don't have to worry about it. You get that scenario here as well, where it's we don't need to think about analytics. There's a different org that does it. They'll worry about the analytics. You want everybody to think about analytics, not just one organization. You don't want these guys to be the high priests of thinking about data. Everybody's got to do it. So companies realize that, and they switch to scenario 2, which is let's mix everything together so they can be closer to the problem, so they can have more influence. And that works for a while until you start realizing that, well, now when we're asking the same question to different areas of the business, we're getting very different answers. And also, since each organization is now separate, they're looking at this and saying, oh, there's this problem we need to solve. And every organization tries to solve it themselves because there's less coordination and you get a lot of redundant efforts. So that doesn't work either. So the companies that start here or are here, how do they solve that problem? They tend to go back to scenario 1, which is, this isn't working. We really need to centralize this so we can get more consistent results and get rid of our redundancies. So we get this pendulum effect, centralization, decentralization. And pretty much every big company does this every few years. What you really need to do is take the best of both worlds. And this is what we refer to here as the embedded model, and a few other companies do it as well, and it does seem to work really, really well. You do have business teams with analysts embedded within the team. And you also may have, this isn't a requirement, but you also may have a separate group of people who work across teams. But the key difference here between this and the fully decentralized model is that they are part of a central analytics team. So they are rolling up to that organization. And the result of this is a few things. And let me go through these. So from the centralized team, you get a couple advantages that are inherent nature of a centralized organization. You get the consistent results. You get the increased efficiency I'm referring to because you're not doing redundant efforts. Another thing you get with a centralized team that you can't get with a decentralized team is somebody to tackle really big efforts. If you've got these different organizations, and each one of them has 4 or 5 analysts in it, or even 10 analysts in it, and you need to do something company-wide that's kind of big and bold, who's going to do it? There's no organization that has the resources to do it. And who's going to help these organizations try and coordinate amongst themselves? It's possible, just not easy. And the last part, which is also really, really important, is it provides career growth for all of us. If we are in separate organizations and just split up into different teams in the decentralized fashion, if you're one of 3 analysts or 4 analysts that are part of that organization, what's your career path? There's only 3 or 4 of you. There's not really much management if you're interested in that. How do you grow in that organization? You could become maybe a product manager, I guess. You can move into engineering, but there's really not much for you in analytics. So creating a centralized organization is pretty critical for that as well. The decentralized nature of having it embedded as well is how we ensure alignment. So the way we do these things here is generally 4 days a week, sometimes 5 days a week, the analysts are physically sitting with the teams that they're working with, that they're part of. And generally we try and make it so that 1 day a week they're sitting as part of the rest of the organization. And we have coordination and all the advantages of the centralized team as well as the advantages of the decentralized team. We call that the embedded model. When you do that, you can then become a core part, particularly of product teams. So most of you guys are working in product companies. You can become a core part of the product team. Historically, at Facebook, this is what a product team looked like. We had engineering, PM, and design. But with the embedded model, you are now sitting with them. You can become the 4th leg, and that's exactly what we have now. If we were to define what a product team is, it's made up of these 4 core pillars. That's really what you need to have. And it's really important because when you are part of the team like this, it enables you to influence all parts of the product cycle. Most people think of analytics as, well, we've got the product, we want to analyze how it's doing. That is this part down here that we already talked about. The product's out, we want to iterate, optimize, make it as good as we can. If you ask most people about, and we even have some of this internally too, well, we don't really need any analysts yet because the product's not out yet. But when you start thinking about it as a core part of the product team, all phases of product development can take advantage of analytics. In the brainstorming phase of what you should even build, you can look at, well, we're building a new photo product. How are people using photos today? What's out there? How do people do X currently? Because that's going to inform what I want to do. What are the most popular things they're doing? What are unpopular things? That will really help me just define the product we're trying to build. Then when the PMs and engineers go off to actually implement it, that's your opportunity to figure out, okay, how are we going to measure the success of this product? And how do I build infrastructure so that the day it launches, I can get data back about, is it doing what we expected it to do? Instead of having a product that launches and then scrambling afterwards and spending weeks or months trying to figure out how to collect the data to see how the product is doing. And then when it launches, you go through the release phase, then you can look at the traditional things we talked about before. How do we optimize it? Is it doing what we wanted it to do, and how do we optimize that? The last thing I want to talk about is culture and what kind of role that plays. 2 scenarios here. Before I start, I just want to say one thing, which is the comment I've got there, that the success, I think ultimately the success of analytics within a company, what makes a company great at analytics versus another company that's not great. Yes, a lot of it has to do with the talent of the analysts themselves, but I think it is more tightly correlated to the way the company thinks about analytics. And so I refer to that as, it's not about the tool set you have, that we're going to do better because we spent millions of dollars on a cool new system. It's not about the tool set, it's about the mindset you've got, and how do you think about it? How do you incorporate analytics into all parts of your company? And most importantly, how do you act on it? So 2 companies. First company, Company A, has ultra-fast, flexible infrastructure. Ask any question you want, get the answer back really quickly. The second one is decisions here are made by people with years of experience. So these guys know what they're doing. It's very organized. We can be very efficient. And the third one is the analysts are measured by very clear service-oriented goals, such as 90% of all reports and requests for reports will be satisfied within 24 hours. Very clear to measure whether you're doing that or not. Now let's look at company B. They've got MySQL, which is good, it's free, on old servers that nobody else wants, and the only other tool they've got is Excel. And then second part of how decisions are made, you've got these product designers arguing with analysts all the time. It's really frustrating, it's pretty chaotic. And the last part is, how do we measure the analysts? We keep talking about this thing called impact. Nobody can really put a number on it. It's hard to define impact, so I sometimes get frustrated as an analyst because I don't really know what I'm supposed to be measured on. So then my question is, which company do you want to work at? And my answer is very, very clearly, I want to work at company B. Aside from this first row, of course. This would be nice. But the other parts, this is exactly the hippo. This is somebody saying, look, I'm going to make decisions. I know, I've been here, I'm experienced. We don't even need the data because I know how this works. And what's this? This is the definition of being reactive. We will meet all requests for reports within 24 hours. This one, yeah, it's chaotic. Definitely can be chaotic. But at least the PMs and the designers are in discussion with us as analysts. So we have a chance to share our opinion. And if we're sharing our opinions, we're inevitably going to have different opinions. So we can discuss and debate. So it may not be as pretty, but the answer is going to come out much, much better. And this, I keep saying we need to measure ourselves on impact. It doesn't mean that measuring impact is easy. In many ways, it can be one of the hardest things to do. There is a book that I was sent not long ago called How to Measure Anything. And a lot of it is, how do you try and get your arms around measuring impact when many times it's not clear how to do it? But just because it's not easy to measure, always, doesn't mean we shouldn't try to measure it, and we shouldn't be focused on that. So very clearly, this is where you want to be. This means you're in the mix. This means you're part of it. So creating that culture is kind of 3 points. The first thing to reiterate, define your goals. They've got to be measurable. If you don't have people working on measurable goals, then data doesn't mean anything to them. If their goal is to build a product that's cool, and we haven't defined what we mean by cool, then what are you going to do with the data that's going to prove that it's cool or not cool when they're not focused on that and there was nothing measurable? And as I said before, data logging has to be treated like QA is. You can't have people think about it as, if I can get to it, I will do it. Second point, we as analysts shouldn't think just like analysts. We should think like we are in a product team often. We should think like a product team. What do we want to do that's big and bold? Not just what do we want to do that's going to provide better service to others. And then the final point is provide training. Certainly to our own analysts, 50% on what you're going to be doing and what tools you should be using. But the other 50% is the mindset of how do you make sure that you're asking the right questions? How do you evangelize? How do you align what you're analyzing with what the organization is interested in so you will have the highest likelihood of them acting on what your recommendations are? But it's not just for the analysts. I would like to see everybody go through this. We have opened up at Facebook our training to pretty much anybody within the company because you don't want to have the situation of the analyst being the only one who can answer these questions. Though I don't expect PMs and engineers and designers to be as good at analysis as we are, it would be phenomenal if they could at least speak the same language and understood the power and the different places that analytics can be used, so you don't get product managers saying, what do I need analytics for? The product hasn't launched yet. So they can understand that. So it should be open to everybody. So to wrap up, ultimately, we as analysts need to own the outcome. Our job is to find a needle somewhere and make sure we can move it, or change products, or change processes. And as I said before, and I want to leave you with this one thought, if nothing changed because of your analysis, unfortunately you haven't added any value. It's really hard to argue that you added value when nothing was different, because I could also argue that if you had not been there, the outcome would be the same. If nothing changed, then the fact that you were there made no difference. So I don't really care how brilliant your analysis was. If nothing changed, you didn't add any impact. How do you make sure you can do that? Understand the needs of the organization so that when you're choosing the thing that you want to analyze, if it is aligned with the goals of the organization, they're more likely to act on it. If they care about churn and you come up with great insights about churn, they're more likely to act on it than if you come up with great insights about how to reduce the size of the product on the web when nobody really cares about that. How to evangelize your insights so that you have to own this part. You can't just throw it over the wall. You've got to work with them to make sure it happens. And then the last part, just again, drive the impact. That's the only measurement you should be measuring yourself by. The people who do this well are the people who are really helping to change the role of the analyst within companies and helping to change the future of the companies that they're in. And as an analyst, I don't think there's any better role that you can play. So that really wraps up my comments for tonight. So I just want to thank you guys for coming. And I think we can do some questions. If anybody has any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer them. And there's some other people in the room too who work with me and could answer questions too if they're more fit for that. So are there any questions? If there aren't, I know it's kind of hot in here. I'd be happy to go back outside and we can finish, if there's any food left, I'd love to go finish some of that too. Any questions? Okay, question over here.
Hi, my name is Erin. So I like the idea of both, kind of the best of both worlds, the centralized and the decentralized structure. It makes sense that you get the best of both worlds. I'm wondering, how do you avoid also getting the worst of both situations, right? So how do you circumvent, I would imagine kind of the worst of both kind of surface as well. How do you ensure that you're avoiding that as well?
Okay, well, the worst part of the centralized organization is that you are not part of the teams that you are working with, and so you're detached. So the embedded model gets rid of the worst part of the centralized organization. The worst part of the decentralized organization is lack of coordination, lack of consistent results, and redundancy. So by having a central team where you get together, all of the analysts roll up to analytic leads, who then all ultimately roll up into my org specifically. We'll all get together every week, multiple times a week, to talk about what we're doing, to share the ideas of what we're focusing on this quarter, to make sure that, oh, you're working on that? Well, I was planning on working on that too. Either we can collaborate, or you'll do it and I'll just take the advantage of the results of you doing it, which means I can now do something else. So we get to communicate a lot more because we're part of one organization. It makes it very easy if we all report into the same structure versus we're all different, we've got different motivations, and yeah, I'll meet with you, but gee, I got something else I got to do too. So I think it is less challenging than I thought it would be to avoid the negative parts. It's a good question, but it turns out that it's a lot less challenging than I thought it would be. Question?
Yeah, I love your extension of the traditional feature team of the normal 3 p.m. engineering dev to add analytics. I think that's cool. One thing that comes to mind for me is maybe places that aren't as big as Facebook is kind of the role overlap. And you see all parallel thing, kind of UX sometimes and PM, they kind of get on each other's toes. I'm wondering, a lot of places I've been, it's like strong PMs do the analytics. I'm wondering kind of how you guys work through the role stuff there.
To clarify, the 4 pillars don't mean 4 people. The 4 pillars are 4 pillars, 4 roles. And if you can have a PM who is a great analyst as well, that's 2 for 1. And I don't know if they get twice the salary, but that's a great situation to be in. The main point was you want to make sure that there is somebody doing analytics. In a small organization, people have to wear many hats. But it really comes down to when you are starting to design new products, are you taking an analytical approach to designing new products? While the implementation is going on, are you starting to build the infrastructure so that we can manage and monitor and look at and analyze the results when this product is launched? And as we are going through the iteration process, again, it can be a PM, it can be a designer, it can be an engineer. I mean, often it's the engineers too who are just going in and running all the queries and showing all the charts. So somebody or more than one person should take that role. It doesn't have to be an individual, and they can have multiple roles and often will. Just that role needs to be covered. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I'm sure that makes sense, and I'm just wondering if you ever, I'm sure there's situations where there's a PM who feels like they own analysis and you have an analyst on the team, so just how they kind of deal with that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have any magic answers for you there, but if there's a PM, what we see more often than a PM saying, I own analysis, particularly when there's an analyst there, it more comes down to the PM who's really good at analysis and just ends up doing a lot of it. Rather than, my goal isn't to do all the analysis for the company. My goal is to make sure that analysis is effectively done at the company. So if you're a PM and you've got really strong analytic background, That means I can take my analysts and put more of their resources elsewhere if you've got it covered. I don't need to do it in that case. I mean, I'll probably have somebody still working with you, but fewer people and less time.
A little bit more commentary on that. So one of my favorite things about Facebook is sort of this no compromise value system that a lot of people have. So I can be a strong analyst working with a strong PM on data, and we may butt heads really consistently on data analytics, and all have a strong point of view, they'll have a strong point of view, and they might be different when we start, but people tend to not compromise their values, and you eventually get to a good place through arguing and fighting and understand people's like points of view and like getting to the best possible outcome. So I actually think a lot of what you're saying is a good thing.
All right. Any other questions? Yes. Back there. I can pass on the mic.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is, can you share some best practices in terms of how to ask the right questions when you have something like product not performing as expected?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's the part of the understand phase. But often the value of the understand phase is if we don't really know what's going on, the understand phase will uncover what's going on. So start with the basic questions of who, what, where, why, and when. Often you leave off the why part. But it's doing the basics of let me figure out what I see when I look at the users. How are they doing things? And what are the trends there? How often are they doing things? And what features are they using? What features aren't they? You will do the analysis asking these basic questions. What will inevitably pop out is something anomalous. So you're looking to find something anomalous because you generally don't know what's going on. If you've got domain experience, you can leverage that, but often the reason you get in this state is because your domain experience didn't work in this scenario. So if I can just provide myself a framework of, you know what, if I start asking these types of questions, these basic questions, I will find an anomaly. And that gives me something to proactively spend my time on to fix. And it may not exactly be the right thing, but while I'm doing that, I can continue doing more understand phase elsewhere. And often, I mean, if you look at one of the premises from the talk last week was one of the premises of growth is it's often more base hits than home runs. So it's 100 little things that you are improving again and again, where you find a place where, why did 20% of people in general enter this flow, but in Brazil, we only have 6%? I don't really know, but it looks like there's an opportunity to improve that there. Hundreds of those is what really leads to long-term growth. So it's coming up with the same basic set of questions. When you do an understand analysis, it's usually the same basic set of questions, looking for anomalies, looking for places where you're under or over-indexed. If anybody has other comments that they'd like to add to that, employees here or visitors too, how you guys might do that, I'd love to hear your comments on it.
Yeah, so did you go to the last talk from Alex Schultz? Okay, so I mean that came up in some context there about the growth accounting model and about retention. So probably for me the number one thing for any product is understanding how many new people are using the product and then to the extent to which they're retained in the product. And are they using the product once and never coming back again? Are they using the product sporadically once every few months and really understanding the user behavior? But the number one way that to drive a product is get new people using it and get the new people that use it retained on the product. So there's a bunch of different like models we have for that. There's actually a really sort of dry but cool presentation that's out there on the internet somewhere from a guy, Danny Ferrante. He's like standing behind this.
It's right there.
Danny!
Danny, right there.
Danny is standing behind a glass wall in the middle of the video. What's that? Dry but awesome. No, but the style was dry. It was standing behind a window, drawing with a marker on the wall, drawing out all these models. It was awesome. So anyhow, but yeah, check out his video because that's like the number one model we use for understanding how products are growing. So
right.
Sorry for calling it dry, Danny.
Danny's actually going to be one of the speakers in the series.
Yeah.
So he'll actually be building a broader talk around that video in the coming months. I think his talk is going to be in October.
And he's going to do the whole talk behind a pane of glass.
It's awesome.
I think we have time for like maybe one or two more questions, right? I think there's a question in the back over there. Here.
When people are communicating results of an analysis to a larger team, maybe it's the product team or maybe it's some other part of the organization, what's the actual deliverable? I mean, there's the traditional slide deck where you put up a bunch of graphs and talk people through it. But ultimately, that can be sort of dissatisfying because people want to a lot of people want to get their hands dirty themselves and play with something interactive. But then they say, oh, but I don't really want to have to write a SQL query or get into Hadoop. And so then one is back in the service-oriented role of building a pleasant interface. I was curious if you've found a sweet spot there.
I think my answer to that is, we'll start with the question, what's the most effective way you've ever had of convincing somebody to do something?
Sitting them down and doing it with them.
Very close. Discussion. So I think the most, talking to them, right? I mean, the PowerPoint, the dashboard are all just tools, but the core, the essence of it is you are talking to them. So it really comes down to, so the short answer is I don't really care whether it's PowerPoint or a dashboard. The core thing is you have got to get them to see the light, and it'll be different for different people. But the fundamental thing is just talk to them. I mean, we have had Word documents, we have had PowerPoints, we have had dashboards. We have more often than not had nothing, where it's a couple screenshots, and we're talking to somebody about this is what this means, and just all we have to do is convince them of it. If they say, I want to play around with it more, well, either we can play around with it with them or we can create something for them. But in general, it just comes down to you just have to communicate with them, talk with them, use whatever tools you're most comfortable using, but often you don't need any. Other than, look, here's a chart that I came up with and here's what it all means and let me just talk to you about it. It saves a lot of time creating this presentation, pixel perfect, that you don't need to. So just talk.
Yeah, a few more things to add there. Like here, everyone is different. So like understanding who you're talking to and what they want is super important. Some people want interactive dashboards. Some people want PowerPoints. For me, the most effective thing is having a story and doing storytelling while you're showing data. So really thinking about like what is the point you are trying to get across, what outcome do you want out of the meeting, what action are you trying to drive, and then really sort of doing the logical deduction of how like one gets to that conclusion and sort of proving your points. Maybe your 5 points actually prove out the deduction. And so being rigorous about the data that you do show that tells the story and is very compelling and that people buy into, that gets to the conclusion that you're trying to make. If you do that properly, you will tend to find even the people that are the most analytical and want sort of the most access to the data will just want those graphs anyways, because that is the logical deduction for how one gets there. So if you can master that, it tends to work across most audiences. So.
All right. Are there any other questions? All right. If not, I think that's it. Thank you, guys. We are out of time, but I appreciate you coming.